The this is the good evening. This is the welcome to the 8th episode of the Mobuku Chronicles, and it is October the 5th in the year 2011 AD. And what is interesting about tonight is there are no crickets, and I don't have my fan on because we had some rain last night and the crickets were singing last night, but they're not singing tonight. So I guess we can say we're officially in the fall because the crickets have gone into their hibernation. So what has really happened since I last spoke is really the continuation of the smashing itself to pieces of the nation state. There has been one very interesting development though, and because the subject matter of tonight's episode is blood and money. In other words, the relationship between human blood and money, and what is the nature of money. And this recently, the state of Utah has instituted a law whereby the citizens in that state may use gold and silver and the Federal Reserve note, otherwise known as the dollar, for their transactions. And this is a very important step in the right direction. And there was this week a summit, earlier this week I think it was, a summit, a monetary conference summit that took place in Utah. And it would appear that several other states are considering taking the same steps, because people, generally speaking, are beginning to recognize the parasitical and toxic nature of the federal government and how it is ruining everybody's lives, and deliberately so, as I've said. So there's two leftovers that I have to relate to you with regard to the consequences of eating meat. And one of them is that, and as I've mentioned this before, the Chinese have aspirations to having a similar standard of living, such as it is of the United States and the so-called developed countries. And this standard of living includes, quote unquote, improving their diet so that they stop eating their normal grains and vegetables and they start eating meat and everything that goes with it. So what I found out, which is of great interest, is that there are 600 million pigs, because that's the meat of choice in China is pork, and there are 600 million pigs being husbanded, so to speak, in China. So that has one pig for every 2 members of the Chinese population. And of course these pigs are being fed corn and soybeans, so that puts more pressure on the supply of corn and soybeans, which just amplifies what I've said in earlier episodes. And as I've mentioned every single time I do one of these episodes, if this is your first occasion of watching the Mobuku Chronicles, then you should go back to this first one and go through them sequence by sequence. And because I have limitations with regard to how much time I can have for each particular upload, there I put them into different, I break them up into 50-minute segments, and they're called, episode 1, 1A, 1B, 1C. Usually it's 3 or 4 15-minute episodes, because I do about an hour or so, 45 minutes to an hour each time. So now we're going to talk. The other thing that I didn't talk about in terms of extreme substances that we take in because we're attracted to them as a result of eating meat as our daily staple food, and that was wine. And the interesting thing I discovered about wine, and I've mentioned before that the mission of alcohol is to when we drink it, is to cut ourselves off from the spiritual world and have any knowledge or interest in the spiritual world. It's like a decisive cutting off from any interest in the spiritual world is what happens as a result of the drinking of alcohol. And what I found out, which is of course very telling, is that the most highest consumption per person per year of wine in the world takes place in the Vatican. So I'll leave you to chew on that one for a while. But to get back to this issue, the theme of this particular episode is to talk about blood and money. Now, I have mentioned before that the relationship of money to the social organism is that it is what blood is to the human organism. And when I wrote this book, The End of Medicine, there's a detailed account in there of the radical macrobiotic theory of digestion and assimilation, which is that in the healthy human being, meaning a human being that is eating whole grains and vegetables as their staple food and has done their ginger compresses on their intestines as described in the book. And if you haven't got a copy, please get one, because you can get it online anytime, through Amazon or Barnes and Nobles or one of these, or even off my website, which, by the way, is up again. I had problems with my ISP, and well, they had a lot of problems, and it took a while to sort it all out, but it's finally up and running today. But it has a slightly different URL. So basically the thing to do is just to Google the alchemical pages, and then you'll find a link to the home page there, and then you can look through it. And I will say that only half of the book is on the alchemical pages. Half of what's in the book is not in the alchemical pages. And this particular subject of this digestion and assimilation of food in the radical macrobiotic theory is the assimilation, is the transformation and transmutation of food into blood. And this begins in the small intestine and is completed by the liver. And so the primary, in the healthy human being, there are two actual sources of blood formation. Well, actually, in every human being there are, but in the case of a person who's eating macrobiotically and has done their ginger compress, which is very important. The ginger compress is very important. And to do it on your abdomen as part of your changing your way of eating to whole grains and vegetables is very critical. And to do the ginger compress on your abdomen without changing the diet is a waste of time. Total waste of time. So, now, there are actually two sources of blood. One of them is the bone marrow. Now, this is one that's widely recognized by the scientific community. And in fact, they think it's the only method, the only process whereby blood is created in the human organism. But that's because when they do their studies on fasting subjects. So necessarily, fasting subjects are not eating, so you would never be able to even consider looking at the digestion is and assimilation as a transformation and mutation of food into blood, starting in the small intestine, because fasting subjects by necessity are not eating anything. However, there have been studies done by what you might call scientists who think outside the box, so to speak, and they have demonstrated unequivocally that when you ligate all the blood vessels coming from the bone marrow, and this has been done in rabbits, they ligated this one particular man. He's a MD, research scientist, and he wrote a book about it, and the book is cited in The End of Medicine, so you can get a copy of that. I think it's called Overcoming Cancer Naturally, by a man called Dr. Morishita. And he showed in there that he ligated the blood vessels coming out of the bone marrow, so that source of blood, which starts with the stem cells in the bone marrow, was cut off, and yet the subjects, which were rabbits on which he did this study, they did not become anemic. So now, what I point out in the book is that when we eat a diet based on meat and potatoes and sugar and all that, then this, over the course of time, leads to a condition of the digestive tract, small and large intestine, which I call chronic intestinal stagnation. And the details are in the book, so you'll have to read the book to get the details. The upshot of this process is that the capacity for the digestive and assimilative processes to transform or transmute food into blood is severely, shall we say, diminished. So now, the interesting thing about this whole process occurring in people that are eating meat and potatoes and all those kinds of, the regular standard fare, is that the bone marrow then becomes the chief source of blood. But this, in terms of yin and yang, because you have to look at everything all the time in terms of yin and yang, the more yang process of creating blood is the one which takes place in the intestines and is started by the small intestine, and the more yin one is the one done from the source being the bone marrow, mainly of the sternum and the skull. That's major places where the bone marrow is active in what's called hemopoiesis. Now, what is really telling about this is that the quality of blood thus created in those human beings that are eating meat and potatoes is severely diminished, and in fact eventually becomes toxic. That's what happens. And that's described in the chapter that I have in here on the process of healing illness, because the process of healing and the process of illness are one and the same, paradoxically enough. But it is. So in that process, one of the stages of this process is